Hello and welcome to the third episode of our investigative marketing series, Into the Funnel. If you're coming to us from our first episode on long-term marketing growth and second episode on creativity, welcome back. I'm Lauren Smith, Editor-in-Chief of Springboard, studioID's content marketing publication. And as always, I'm joined by our marketing experts, Lieu Pham, VP of Global Strategy at studioID, and Travis Gonzalez, Strategy Director at studioID.
Yes, so we know that we live in a time of content abundance and with that rising audience skepticism. And today it's more important than ever to build audience trust, but it's also incredibly elusive. So how do marketers build audience trust? Today, we're going to do a deep dive of that and tackle that question of how do we build it, how do we maintain it, and what's the role of audience trust in growing marketing and brands?
To help us better understand how to build audience trust, we're joined by Pfizer's own Ellen Gerstein, Senior Director of Digital Communications. Ellen's dedicated to revolutionizing how pharmaceutical companies encourage science curiosity and build trust with followers. So Ellen, we're really excited to have you here today.
Thanks for having me on.
There's a million different ways for brands to think about defining trust. I think what stands out the most to me is the transparency element. Trust really comes down to both the brand and the consumer or the audience having a mutual understanding of what the other is trying to get out of the relationship, out of the conversation, and out of the content.
Pop psychology take on this, right? I think I'd define trust as a coping mechanism, right? There's just so much information out there that we just don't have that cognitive resources to sort through it all. So I think we need those trusted sources of information. So there's a huge opportunity for brands to be that source of information for people, whether it's politics, marketing, science, healthcare, or even parenting. I think it's great to be able to decode that complexity for your audience, for your customers.
And Ellen, specifically, I know that trust is incredibly important to a brand like Pfizer. What role does it play in your kind of day-to-day and in running a brand like Pfizer?
When it comes to trust at Pfizer, I think back to the early days of the pandemic when we were starting to do research on vaccines. We were getting ready to send our candidates into the clinic. And we started talking about how we were going to get the world to trust in our vaccine were it to be successful and come out of the clinic as a product. And we knew that trust was not something we could take for granted, and it was something that we were going to have to work on building day by day. And everything we did was going to build up to the moment of asking somebody, to place their faith in this product. So it was something that we never took for granted. It was something that we absolutely wanted to continue to build upon. And still to this day, trust is so important to us when we look at public health and, how we can serve our patient communities with breakthroughs that will matter in their lives.
Well, first of all, you need to just settle into the idea that it takes patience, discipline, and commitment. It's about playing that long game. I think every relationship is different, has different problems, different challenges. So you can't treat every community or every audience in the same way. And it's about just thinking through, what it takes to actually build trust, which is honoring your commitments, delivering value, and being consistent and being reliable.
I love what Lil said about building trust is something that you do as a long game, because for us, we look at it as a day-by-day thing that our audience places a lot of trust in us. They come to us because they have a condition in their life that they want more information on. They may be a caregiver for somebody who they need answers for their condition. And they're not coming to us because they have other sources. They're looking to us to provide the information that they need to take a next step. So when we're able to provide that to them, whether it's through an article, through a patient story that's in a video, or even through a podcast, that goes a long way in building trust. And we know that the more content that we can give them that's relevant to their needs, the more they're going to come back. We saw that during the pandemic. In the early days, it was all about very simple questions that needed to be answered. How do I keep from getting COVID? How do I keep my family safe? Do I really need to keep 6 feet distance? So we took those questions one at a time and answered them. Hand washing was a big thing at first. We had a lot of content around that. And those were some of our earliest tweets. Those were noticed by people in our senior management saying, this is great. We need to do more of this. We need to show that we're a company that cares about finding a solution and that we're a trusted source of information. And for us, that became our North Star.
I think that's a really big and important call out, Ellen. I think we see that a lot on the content marketing side, where a lot of brands think building trust is a grand gesture of sorts. You produce one video, you produce one large kind of ebook or playbook, and then kind of expect everyone to fall in line with what your brand is saying. And I think the fact that you were able to call out these small moments of, everyday advice during a very tumultuous period in society, I think really kind of emphasizes that it's showing up in those small ways, like you mentioned.
I would also assume that accuracy and transparency are pretty big factors in building trust with your audience at Pfizer, Ellen. I'm wondering, are there instances where you've actually just gotten it wrong in terms of the information that you're providing? What happens there? How does that impact the trust issue with your audience?
Luckily, we haven't had too many instances of that. But one of the things that we really promised from the beginning, and it was something that we engaged in with about 12 other pharmaceutical companies, and it was called The Pledge. And it was a gathering. The CEOs of these companies got together and signed the pledge that they would share information. They would be transparent when it came to data. We weren't, trying to collude against public health. And I think it went a long way in reassuring people that we were in it for, trying to get us out of the pandemic, not necessarily to prolong it or for, nefarious purposes. And, in the public's eyes, it went a long way to reassuring individuals about what we were doing. That's all a part of the, transparency, trust, authenticity that we wanted to put out there. It doesn't do us any good to bury things and hide things because, that the Wayback Machine will find it.
I think that's what's changed, right, about brands. I think in maybe, yesteryear, brands were expected to always be 100%, buttoned up and correct and just really polished. But we recognize brands as just, human. They make mistakes. And I think that owning that, being vulnerable and also owning your mistakes, I think that goes a long way to building trust.
Well, there was a lot in this process that was new. I'm new to pharma. I joined Pfizer just over 6 years ago. So I had never gone through this kind of lifespan of the product. And frankly, this was such a fast lifespan. It was an education in itself. And the ability to talk about everything that went on is very unique. From inception to trials to FDA approvals. I mean, my mother-in-law was watching, the Verbac on TV. Most people don't do that for medications, but, this was available to people. It was science class made available for everybody. So it was out there, and we knew that this was something that we had to be a part of and had to, show up for. And if something changed, we had to be there as the ones to say, yes, this guidance changed. This has been updated, and be as accurate as possible. For us, the most powerful thing about creating a content persona was it was a gift, not just for my team, but for the organization. It allowed us to explain who the audience was, not just in broad terms, but in very specific terms. So take any content that we're creating for parents. We knew that there were people who were going to have to make decisions in 2 years' time about whether or not they were going to vaccinate their kids. So in a broad sense, you're creating an article, a video, a podcast. If you're able to sit there and say, this is Patty. Patty has 3 kids, and they are 10, 8, and 5. And at some point, there is going to be a vaccine available for them. And Patty's going to have to decide whether or not to vaccinate her kids. What information is she going to need? You start to think in your head what Patty is going to think about as she makes that decision. So for our teams, it became much easier to put together content to match that persona. So every time we were trying to do that, it worked for our teams. The other content persona that we loved was the science curious person. I can't remember the exact name of the person, but it was somebody who didn't just read an article. They kind of started with an article, but then they wanted to dive deeper and go more into the topic and more in depth. And that was fun because we knew that person would kind of dig through the site. And we wanted to make sure that there were as many ways to start with an article, but keep going in the article, and then go to related topics. And not just related topics, perhaps in vaccines, but in other, topics in our pipeline or in early stage research or in artificial intelligence. And we kept thinking, this persona really wants to geek out on our science. How can we find ways to keep them on the site and keep them engaged? And that became the most fun persona to write to.
Travis, I would love to hear, I know you're big on personas and I've seen you make some pretty excellent ones over the years. I would love to hear how you actually make those actionable for content teams, because it's one thing to look at something and say, this is a software developer in San Francisco, but how do you actually make that come to life and make it easy to create content against?
Totally. Yeah. And I think it goes back to what Ellen was saying is like, what are these folks actually caring about? And I think what content personas allow you to do is strip away all of the preconceived needs of your brand and kind of focus fully on what the audience is caring about.
I like what both Ellen and Travis, you're talking about, thinking about that person as you're creating the content and making it actionable. And I think sometimes personas, I have, a love and hate relationship with personas because sometimes they're just over engineered or, too overly complicated when, the whole intent or, the purpose of personas are to actually help us deliver value to our audience.
It's a reference guide, and I think that's where people get stuck too. It's not saying you must plug in every single hole that is emerging from the persona. It's, let me use this to inspire my content and make sure it aligns generally with what they're thinking of.
Right. And Ellen, you mentioned, when we were talking about this show, that the indicator that personas are working is that when someone else quotes you or quotes a persona.
That's been my favorite thing when we'll be sitting in a meeting and somebody will say, well, I think this would be a perfect article for Debbie. And people who may not know who Debbie is will sit there and go, wait, who is Debbie? And my team will sit there and chuckle going, oh, they've listened to us. They've read the persona listing. And that's really the mark of success. When people get on board with how we're trying to do this and understand the audience that we're trying to reach, it's just so refreshing.
Yeah, I think it's first having a little bit of a come to terms with the reality around the nature of marketing, especially content marketing. As we all know, it's an incredibly crowded space. There's a lot of topics out there. I think knowing that you are going to be one of many sources that folks are going to go to get their information. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean if one brand is covering one particular category, you can't touch that, especially if it has business value to you. You should touch it. But the secondary question you should be asking is, what can I bring to the table that's a unique perspective or contrarian or a little bit controversial but still reflects what my brand cares about? Is the reader going to walk away in a better perspective or learning something new from that? And so I would challenge, marketers looking to create those compelling stories to not necessarily go so far out of their backyard, but find new things to place inside of it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that we get obsessed with benchmarking against our peers or competitors. To your point, Travis, there's so many sources. Your competitors are no longer the direct or category competitors of your SEO, right? It's anyone that's producing content on a similar topic or vying for the same audience. That's extremely fragmented landscape that we're operating in. So forget about the competitors. And also, why are the competitors setting the bar? You should be setting the bar. you should be benchmarking against yourself.
At the beginning of the pandemic, I remember sitting down with one of our senior medical leaders and talking about different sites like the CDC and the WHO and how those would be the go-to sites during the pandemic, that they would get the bulk of the traffic and we should kind of defer to them, not just look to them for information, but expect that they would be the go-to sites. But that really wasn't the case. The traffic was everywhere. And I think that was people just wanted information and they didn't care where they were getting it from. Sometimes they needed many different sources. They were ravenous to find answers to their questions. And if that meant coming to Pfizer, they were going to do that. So we put those medical leaders in videos and had them talking to our followers. And that was one of the most powerful things that we ended up doing. And those were the same medical leaders who said, I don't think people will come to us. But as soon as they started doing it, they said, all right, we'll get on video. What do you want us to do? And it was a really interesting kind of case study for me because it changed our perspective. We didn't think we'd be in the game, and yet we became part of the game and became one of the leading sites for traffic in this medical information area. So, the lesson learned there was don't count yourself out prematurely. Make sure that you have the right content, make sure your SEO is up to snuff, make sure you have those trusted sources and see where you can go. Because we became one of those top sites for public health information. Really made a difference.
I also love the point that you're making about creating sort of a community of experts as well, and saying, okay, we are going to be a trusted source of information, but we're also not going to be the only source of information. And you're facilitating accurate, reliable, credible information from a range of experts that you've vetted yourself. So I think that's also an important part of building trust with audience as well, saying, okay, we're not going to be the experts in everything, but you can rely on us to help you find that information.
We spent a lot of time in Welcome using the Idea Lab at first because we were trying to get a grasp on it and see what people were talking about, what were the top terms coming up. And I think overall, when we look at content, we think, is this something that people would expect Pfizer to weigh in on? Is this something that makes sense based on our core values? Should we take a stand in this and have a voice in this conversation? We did a content partnership with the Skim and a creator. Her name is Color Me Courtney. And we wanted to do something a little bit lighter on mental health, because that's something that's, during the pandemic certainly came up a lot. And science, mental health. Courtney is all about color theory. So we thought, how can we do the science of color to support your mental health? She did a great video talking about different colors that you can wear to affect your mood. And it completely overperformed. And the comments that we got on it were so positive. And some people were kind of like, I'm not necessarily getting it. But, in my mind, Pfizer supporting mental health, supporting, things that make you feel good about yourself, it was a no-brainer for me. And, our followers definitely responded positively to that, which, warmed my heart.
I think that interrogation of topics, Ellen, is really important too, because I think that's kind of my reaction when I hear that question, is making sure you stop to ask why you're covering a topic and why it matters to your brand. I can think of, 5 brands off the top of my head that have decided, greenwashing is a problem, or environmental sustainability, let's talk about that. But they don't have the right folks in the room to qualify why they're talking about that, or their products might have an issue that they haven't thought through that negatively impacts that conversation. And so what happens is they get a little bit of backlash, or they lose an element of that audience trust because they haven't thought about the implications or their position in that topic. So I think the ability for Pfizer to kind of take a look at that broadscape with the amount of high stakes that were there and say, this is the right space for us because of XYZ is an incredibly powerful exercise for a marketer to take.
Yeah, and just to bring it back to having actual strategy and being aligned internally about what you're going to talk about as well, I think is key to determining, no, we're not going to talk about that. Oh, yes, absolutely, this is something we want to cover. And as you know, we have a really robust methodology. We do this, every day with brands, is just work through, why they would cover particular topics, how they would actually talk about that topic, and what expertise and what value they're going to bring to that conversation. I think that's a really important part of what we do at studioID. And I think it's a real pain point challenge for a lot of brands and marketers out there, right? What are the conversations we want to own out there? What are those ownable conversations, right? And I think it's equally important to know what you're not going to talk about. So yeah, I really like those examples.
What did Andy Warhol say? Everyone would be famous for 15 minutes. I didn't realize he was talking about our company and our brand, not necessarily us individually. At Pfizer, we spent a lot of time holed up in our, hobbit hovels, doing the work to set up our content and communication to be ready when our vaccine was hitting prime time. But when our vaccine did hit prime time, and I mean literally hit prime time, it was kind of a surprise for all of us. Being in the zeitgeist was not something we were prepared for. As much as some of us got through the pandemic by watching various TikTok videos, to be a part of them and to be mentioned in them, didn't have that on my bingo card. I think my best advice is to sit back and watch. Don't try to be too much a part of the experience. Don't try to get in there and capitalize on it. I think one of the beautiful things was seeing these organic videos and memes and everything just kind of happen. It was truly extraordinary to see. But the biggest piece of advice I would give is to resist the temptation to try to replicate it and to get in there and be a part of it, to say, well, we've got to make our own videos. We've got to make our own content that plays off of this. That may not be your wheelhouse. That certainly wasn't our brand. Nobody expected us to all of a sudden start doing the TikTok-y thing. Nobody wants me to. My children made it very clear, like, you can watch them, you can do whatever you want. Do not dance on TikTok. And I think that was very smart advice from them. Like I said, there's something that's incredibly authentic about that. And you can kill it very quickly by trying to replicate it for your brand. I think just kind of watch it, let it flow. That said, if something happens where there's violent misinformation or disinformation or something really goes south, then that's when you get involved and take steps to correct and to course correct. But if it's kind of flowing and people are having fun with it, let it go.
I really like that. And I feel like that kind of bubbles up a larger kind of like piece of advice to marketers, which is reward your audience early and often. In Pfizer's case, you were kind of giving them the reward of creativity. You let them build this community around creating memes and kind of whistling in the dark of a very kind of uncertain environment and experience, and use Pfizer as an outlet for that. And for some brands, that it's providing that outlet. For others, it's participating. But I think knowing how you can engage your audience in the right way, reward them for their loyalty and their patience and their involvement is really interesting coming out of that.
Yeah, and remember, fame doesn't guarantee success, right? Fame just captures attention, and it's a great opportunity to then to convey your values and your value to your audience as well, and be consistent and not let it get to your head, right? So I think it's a great opportunity once a brand achieves fame, and that is, by the way, something that we talk a lot about. It's like, how do you achieve fame as a brand? Because that helps to build, mental availability and brand salience and all those good things to keep you top of mind. But how do you sustain that? That's the real question. That's the follow-up. And that is really about audience trust, to bring it back to the topic, And that's about maintaining those relationships, introducing who you are again to the audience who may already know you, but maybe tell them something a little bit about yourself that they may not be aware of, something that you can give them, in terms of information, education, inspiration, and keep that going. So I think that's a huge opportunity for a brand once they achieve that fame.
And it was important to let people know and remind people that this wasn't going to last forever. And that we needed to, as much as we were making plans for when we were releasing our vaccine and whatever was going to happen, we certainly couldn't have planned that. We needed to plan the next phase, which was, okay, we're in the zeitgeist. We're not going to be in the zeitgeist forever, and we're going to be a target very soon. Let's start making plans for that. And when the first videos started coming out on TikTok, I sent them around with a note that said 14 minutes and counting. Because I knew like our time was going to be short, and other people got what I was saying. And we started to kind of pivot and think, all right, what's our next stage? How do we continue to maintain this trust? How do we keep supporting our community and let them know that we haven't changed and, we're still going to be there for them? Continue to maintain our desire to contribute to public health.
I'll keep this short and simple. It's when they make you part of their lives, right? You're part of their everyday habits. You're their go-to information for whatever topic or conversation they're interested in. And it's really about having that, that friend or that person that you can go to for any advice. So that would be a great marker of success.
I like to look at referral traffic. Is there kind of a digital and non-digital word of mouth happening with your brand? Are people sharing the things that you're creating? Are they going to bat for your brand and using it to prove out your own arguments? Also looking at the comments, are people actually engaging with the work itself? Do they see it worth their time to participate in? And I also, from a B2B perspective, since we play in that space a lot, are experts sharing the content? Are they using that to further their own discourse? So that, for me, is a really big indicator of if you're getting the trust of professionals, you are doing something right.
Awesome. And Ellen, you had the pleasure of having an entire poll measure Pfizer's trust and how it kind of accelerated. So tell me a little bit more about the Axios-Harris poll.
The Axios-Harris poll was a very interesting moment for us because we jumped up an unprecedented 49 points in the poll to come up into the top 10 in 2021. And that was remarkable for us. And it showed the work that everyone did to get us there. Our scientists who worked on the product, our communications people who worked on our messaging so people understood what we were doing, just everybody working together on that. And I want to echo, well, I'd love to be short and sweet like Lil. I can't.
I'm not always.
It's not something I do well. But I want to echo what Travis said, because my ultimate measure of success is when a customer goes to bat for you. When your followers take up the mantle and support you, whether it's in social media or, somebody on a chat show or wherever the opportunity is, that they become ambassadors for your brand on their own volition. To me, that is the ultimate sign of success, that you have earned their trust.
So in summary, trust is the element that causes someone to choose your brand over another, and it's what keeps them coming back and making that choice again and again. And it's not this totally abstract concept either. With the right strategies in place, you can actively work toward it, measure progress, and build an audience of true loyalists. And with that, we arrive at the end of today's episode. Ellen, we can't thank you enough for joining us. You've been an exceptionally entertaining guest, so thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Lauren.
And a big thanks, as always, to our experts, Lil and Travis. If you're interested in learning more about how you can develop and nurture audience trust, check out the resource kit we put together for you on the subject. And be sure to watch this space as we continue to explore more of the big questions shaping the marketing industry today.
We're always looking out for the next big question to tackle. So if you have ideas around that or want to share your best brand to demand practices, strategy tips, marketing know-how, be sure to tweet us at @thestudio_ID.
And with that, thanks so much for tuning in again. See you next time.